Hello, I'm Vicki Seewaldt. I'm the chair of population science and also the associate director for population science at the City of Hope Comprehensive Cancer Center. And I have lived on grants for many years and they have supported my salary. So what I wanted to do is share with you some ideas for how to get started with a grant, how to build a grant review committee, and looking at a grant from the standpoint of reviewers. So this is entitled Crowdsourcing Your K or R Grant and What to Do When There's Nobody Here to Help You. A lot of investigators are in institutions where they're working on their grants all alone. And this is true for a lot of my mentees that I work with. And so I'm going to talk about how we built a crowdsourcing group and something that you can do at your own institution. So this is another one of my groups. And again, I will introduce people later on, but this is part of the Zoom group that I do with people all over the country. So I think everybody knows the components of a grant. There's an abstract, there's a specific aims page, there's innovation and significance, preliminary data methods, etc. I'm going to pay attention and talk about the specific aims page. And the reason for this is that the specific aims page is really your ad to the reviewers. And this is where I think a lot of grants are made or broken. Ultimately, your methods have to be sound and they have to be workable. But the specific aims page is your introduction between you and the reviewer. So the first thing to think about is when you're writing your grant, and this is normal and human, you're sitting there going, oh, me, oh, poor me. And this is normal and human. But instead of thinking about yourself, you want to really think about how do I make this grant easy to read and compelling for the reviewer. So you really want to think about all about the reviewer as you're writing. And this is not something that's particularly natural. But, these reviewers, when you start writing grants, you think of them as these, terrible humans who are going to trash your grant. But in the end, they're people just like you and me. They're human beings with kids. And typically, these are the good guys. These are the people who give up their time to go and, be paid almost no money for review. And so be good to them and they'll be good back. So first thing, grants are not papers. And we all learn how to write papers early in our career. And so when we start writing grants, we start thinking, oh, well, this is just a smaller manuscript. And we start with a very long introduction to our topic. I would suggest that that may not be the best approach, because once you start giving this very long introduction, you don't tell the reviewer where you're going. So what I'd like to make you think about is that your aims page is like the cover of a magazine. So here's a Bon Appetit magazine. So it went out of business, but I had never bought Bon Appetit before, but I saw this beautiful, cover with this, raspberry sorbet and this pistachio crust. And it was so beautiful. And the colors were so lovely. And I'd made baked Alaskas with my daddy. And, it just did everything for me. And I had to have the magazine. I never made the baked Alaska here, but I just had to have it. So you want to really go and talk about your grant in a way that gets the reviewer really wanting your application. So having grown up with Sesame Street, we had, one of these things is not like the other. And I would suggest that your aims page is very much like a magazine cover, that it's a way of giving a lot of focused information very quickly. So here, this is your Bon Appetit. This is all about parties for spring. These are the things that they are featuring, plus this. So it's very different from a manuscript where you spend a lot of time leading in and introducing. So telling a compelling story is job number one. So I'm going to tell the story of Virginia. And Virginia was 2 years away from her promotion decision between assistant and associate. And she needed to get an R1 and she was not getting one. So let me just tell you about her grant, why it seemed like it was not doing well. To come to the conclusion of what happened with Virginia, now she has 3 R01s, and I think she passes me in the hall and, waves to me occasionally if she's in the mood. So she's done really well. Anyway, so she was writing her grants like a manuscript. So in the United States, rectal cancer affected an estimated 39,610 individuals in 2015, with 68% of individuals surviving more than 5 years. The median age at diagnosis for rectal cancer was 65 years, which is typically younger than that for colon cancer. A common long-term adverse effect of rectal cancer survivors is bowel dysfunction with symptoms that range from frequent and urgent bowel movements, loss of control with swelling, constipation, gas, bloating, and oscillations between diarrhea and constipation. Okay, on and on. You don't know what this grant is about. Plus, again, it reads like a paper. And the way I kind of put it politely is, great for a paper, but for a grant, it's just not getting me going. It doesn't have that bon appetit moment. So we worked with Virginia, and what we did is we asked her to talk about why this grant was important to her. And she kept on talking and talking. And all of a sudden, then she said something that really got all of our attention. And this is, the power of having a crowdsourcing group. So we were all sitting there listening to Virginia. And then she came up with this one incredible statement. And we were like, oh my God, that's it. So what happened to this? So men and women are increasingly surviving rectal cancer, but survivorship carries a price. The most dreaded survivorship-related complication for rectal cancer is fecal incontinence, and then put in parentheses, loss of bowel control. Individuals with fecal incontinence have a 70% chance of losing their job, a 60% chance of divorce, and a very high suicide rate. And that was a sentence that really got to us. Currently, the only treatment for rectal cancer is a colostomy. And then in parens, basically that you divert the bowel to the skin and your poop comes out in a bag on on the skin surface. In preliminary data, we have identified that if we individualize the amount, the timing, and the composition of food, that individuals are able to control fecal incontinence without a colostomy. Here, we aim to, depending on whether it's a K or an R grant, leverage an ongoing SWOG cooperative trial where we'll test out our intervention and identify whether we're able to control fecal incontinence by individualizing meals. Well, this got funded. So how do you make fecal incontinence exciting? Well, I guess there's at least one answer, and it seemed to work for the reviewers. When we start on specific games pages, I always meditate on this picture of my daughter. Now, this is when she was about, 5 years old. She's now 25 years old and working at a really important job and all that. And she hates this picture. She thinks this picture is just evil and mom is evil for putting it up. So please bear with me. But I go look at this picture before I start writing a grant. So first thing here, there is one message, princess, okay? And if you don't get it by the tiara, you get it by the message here. It says princess. So that's the message. Now, I am a lover of throwing everything into the grant. So I'll start talking about triple negative breast cancer and disparities and social determinants of health and metabolic dysfunction and epigenetic signaling. And by the end of the reviewer says, this is very dense and hard to read. So you want one message. Many times reviewers review either 5 o'clock in the morning, and that was me. I would get up at 5 a.m. before my family woke up to review on the weekends, or after everybody's gone to bed. So you really want to make it easier for the reviewer and make sure they get the message. This is what the grant is about. And you need to carry that all the way through the aims page. The next thing is space. When people said, old people get old eyes. I was like, I was 30 and I was like, old eyes, what's that? Well, now that I'm old and I have old eyes, what it means is that when you read across a line, you tend to sort of go up and down between lines. So you want to have a lot of space on the page. Something that's really crowded and there's no space on the page makes it really hard for old reviewers with old eyes to go review. And you want those people to be on your team and you want them to love you, not say, God, that thing was just terrible to read. Because usually it's the older reviewers who are the senior people who command a lot of respect in the grant review. And if they come out and say, God, this grant was really confusing and hard to read, probably a lot of people are going to go and agree with them. So you want to put lots of space on the page for old people like me. Now, the next thing is innovation. Okay. So there are a lot of traditional things here and one innovative thing. When I started writing my grants, all I wanted to do is turn the whole world of breast cancer upside down in my K award. And that was not a very good idea. So here, what you're looking for is you want one piece of innovation set in nice, hard, fast, well-documented things in the literature. So this is called, supporting the application, the premise of the application. So here you've got, traditional tiara, traditional black velvet party dress for the princess jewels, and the traditional princess makeup. So everything is pretty traditional except for the glasses. Now, the last thing to think about is potential pitfalls and alternatives, especially with a new R01 or a K application. You can't just say, oh, my mentor or my collaborator knows everything about this technique, so it's going to work fine. That's not what the reviewers are looking for. They're looking for your ability to creatively problem solve. So to try to think about what could go wrong and show how creative you could be at coming up with an answer. So the princess here went to school and her mom didn't cut her hair. And so the princess was going to school with hair in her face. And the teachers were writing letters home to the princess's mother, aka me, who was really busy and distracted and was like, oh yeah, another letter, let's toss that one. So the princess decided to take matters into her own hands. So what she did is she got a pair of scissors and she got a bunch of her dolls, went into her room, closed the door, and practiced hair cutting on her dolls. And then, as you can see here, she went and cut her own bangs. Okay. Now, moral of the story, all grants have potential pitfalls. However, what you want to do is deal with them creatively, not just say, oh, I'm not going to have any problems, but to think about, what could go wrong and how you would deal with it. So for example, there's what's called the Valley of Death. So you propose a focused testable hypothesis. That's good. That's what you want to do. And the reviewer comes along and goes, well, there's a focused testable hypothesis. However, we know that Wnt signaling does all kinds of other things besides this. How are they going to account for this? How are they going to account for the breadth of Wnt signaling? On the other hand, if you proposed a grant looking at the breadth of Wnt signaling, the reviewers would come back, same reviewers, and say, oh, well, this grant is too broad. It's unfocused. It lacks a testable hypothesis. So what you can do in your potential pitfalls is to deal with the Valley of Death and say, okay, so Wnt signaling, doesn't it do other things besides what we propose? And there you can say, we aim to do a broad profiling approach in alternative methods. And if we start to pick up other keynotes, we will integrate this into our model. So this is a way of trying to get around the idea that you can't do everything at the same time. Okay, next. So, okay, make the reviewers happy. So when I started writing, and this was one of my first grants, is I wrote this long, horrible paragraph. And this is really, really hard to review. And it's also really hard to write. So we started coming up with a more focused method where you break things up into little paragraphs. And this, I think, makes it a lot easier to write, but it also makes it easier for the reviewers. And also try to include a nice diagram here. So the way that, so I'm going to just break it up into sections and just talk about each section. And then I'm going to talk about a specific example. So the first paragraph here, ideally, it catches the fire in the heart of the reviewers. And like what I described with Dr. Virginia's grant on fecal incontinence, something that really kind of gets your heart, but also tells you where the grant is going. So I've got a lovely husband, Eric, and, he's mostly retired. And we used to come into work before COVID, and he'd come in much later than I would. And then he'd park the car in God knows where. And so, I go, okay, Eric, let's go home. And I'd be like, let's go to the car. And so he said, well, okay, let's start walking. And then he'd say, turn right. And I'd turn right. And then he'd say, turn left. And I'd turn left. And then he'd say, turn left again. And I'd be like, Eric, could you just tell me where the stupid car is so I know where we're going? And this is very helpful. If the reviewers know where they're going, then it helps them to follow your line of thought because they already know where your hypothesis is going to end up. Not to go and reiterate your hypothesis, but just give them some sense of where the grant is going. Then the next section is background. What's the big picture? If you're applying to an NIH study section, it should be the topic related to what the study section is about. You really want to make sure that the reviewers feel that this grant should go to this study section. It is never good when the reviewers are feeling like, God, I got this additional grant. Why did they send it here? It doesn't belong here. This is, not going to do well with your grant. So big picture and how that fits in. Then some specific background from the literature. Then preliminary data from the literature. So this is supporting the premise of your application. And then the preliminary data that you generate. So again, you have the premise being supported both by the published literature and the preliminary data. But don't go into exhaustive detail. And then the hypothesis. So if you're able to break it up like that, it really makes your job of writing the grant a whole lot easier. So I'm going to give you an example from Mustafa's grant. So he was very interested in a gene called PAF, PAF. I personally could not care less about this gene. Please don't tell Mustafa, but this was his love of life, and this is what he wants to study. So he started out by, platinum agents initially work in pancreatic cancer, but resistance rapidly develops. I mean, this is badness. And here he's going to propose a new therapeutic target and work out the details of this target. Then big idea, defects in DNA repair are associated with platinum resistance. So, that sets the big idea. Then introduction to his DNA repair gene, PAF, that is his love of life. And so information from the literature in general about how this plays a role in DNA repair. Then next, preliminary data from the literature showing that PAF is a promising target. Then his preliminary data, and then his hypothesis, and then you're done. So if you're able to break these things up into sections, it allows you to much better focus your grant. And it also provides a really nice structure for the reviewer. You want to get them excited by the first paragraph that this is a really cool idea, that this is important. But after that, you just want the rest of it to be like vanilla ice cream. And they're saying, yeah, oh yeah, no, you want to anticipate what information they want to get next and be able to then provide it. And then they go, oh, this person's so smart. They knew exactly what information I needed next. So next thing is the aims. Okay, and this is Mustafa. So I used to write these big paragraphs here. And so this is the same will test the hypothesis that PAF facilitates translational synthesis at platinum stalled replication forks by stabilizing pCNA DNA interaction and preventing replication forks collapse rather than unmasking. Okay, these are great paragraphs, but you want to think about the magazine cover. You don't have a big paragraph at the beginning on the magazine cover. You have bullets about, that they're going to have summer parties for spring and new ideas for your Seder dinner, et cetera. So this should go under rationale for your methods for AIM 1. That's a beautiful place for this because that's where the reviewer really wants to dig in to what you're doing. So what we suggested instead is what I'm going to call bake the cake, eat the cake, rate the cake. So basically get stuff done. So here we broke this down, this paragraph into generate PAF mutant cell lines carrying mutations in the DNA box and PIP domain, characterize the DNA binding domain mutations in translational synthesis, and investigate the roles of the PIP-op mutations. So this is really nice because the reviewer, a lot of times, like a good reviewer will go and review the grant, a month or even 2 months ahead of time. And that's the reviewer you really want in your corner because these are the really prepared reviewers. And then they'll be like, okay, yeah, what did I write? What did I write? So this is very helpful because it provides bulleted information on what you're going to do. And they can go back to this when they're preparing to present your grant. And this is basically to talk about the action items. This is what I'm going to generate. This is I'm going to characterize. This is I'm going to investigate. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about crowdsourcing. And so I'm going to introduce Dr. Ziegler-Johnson, Dr. Cannon, Dr. Nunzi, and Dr. Tassis, who are part of my Tuesday group. So one of the problems with grants is a lot of times you don't have people who have time to review your grant. And when you send your AIMS page off to somebody, you want to make sure that you have a lot of time. You give them a couple of months to look at it. So not like a week before it's due. This is not a good thing. Having a grant writing group like this allows everybody to work as a group to look at AIMS pages. So once a week with each of my groups, and I have 3 of them, I start talking, we start reviewing people's grants. And so what we do is we put the grant on the screen and we read through. It's really helpful to read the grant through because you catch things, even like my own grants, when I stop to read them out loud, I'm like, oh my God, how did I say this? This doesn't make sense. Or there's a spelling error here, or grammar error, or I left a word out. Just listening to it is really important. And also it's really much easier to see mistakes when somebody else is doing it rather than you're doing it. Again, I love to put everything in the planet in a grant and I pack it tight and full, and this is no good. This is not going to make the reviewer happy. So this allows people to come together. It's an established group. There has to be some trust building. So when I first formed the group, I got together some new investigators. These guys are from a couple of different institutions. And what I did is we looked at my grants. So this was the trust building because you have to, be really cool that people are going to be constructive. And it's hard to have your grant looked at by a lot of people. This is another one of my groups. So this is Dr. George, Dr. Krishnan, Dr. Lefkowitz, and Dr. Lung. So again, small group, nice people. You try to get people who will get along. I try to get people from different disciplines because if somebody from a discipline other than yours can understand a grant, that is a really good thing. You don't want to go for the fanciest language. For a while, I was getting nothing funded. And so I started looking at the grants that were getting funded. And instead of using fancy language, they all used very plain language. And They conveyed very complex ideas in simple language, which is hard to do. But you want to be able to make sure that your grant is accessible to just about everybody. So first thing we do is we put the Ames page up and we look at how does it look on the page. And we say, lots of space here and also really nice figure. People learn in different ways. And some people are very visual. I'm very visual. Some people are more words. And so it's good to have both here to cater to both individuals. Now, the next thing is we read the first paragraph out loud and we say, okay, what's the scientific problem? Because a lot of times what the first paragraph says and what the hypothesis says don't match. Is the story compelling? Do we have a sense of where the grant is going? So in that first paragraph, we try to tell what's exciting about this, why it's important, a little bit, like one sentence about the preliminary data and where we want to go with the grant. And we want to be able to use the same terms and technology that we use in that first paragraph, and we want to carry it through. So don't use one term and then switch terms halfway through. Next thing is what study section. So that's the second paragraph here. You want to make sure that your published preliminary data that you're pulling up, and preliminary data can be what other people have published, just acknowledge it. Does it support the premise? We want to look at what's the big picture here. How is the idea sort of set and what might be missing? Then next, we want to look at, does the preliminary data provided by the PI support the hypothesis? And this gets into something really important. Study sections love first author publications for Ks and last author publications for Rs. So if you're applying for a first-time R, they're going to be looking that you have a senior author publication that is linked and supports your new grant. So it's really important to do that for K applications. Make sure you get your publications tucked in from your thesis. That's really important. And, make sure that you have at least one first author publication, even if it's a small one that comes out. And then, is there a focused and testable hypothesis? So in my first K award, I wanted to cure all of breast cancer, and I hypothesized that loss of RAR beta promotes breast cancer. That's something that takes, many, many R1s. So instead, what I really needed to say was loss of RAR beta promotes G1 S phase arrest through cyclin D1 signaling pathway and apoptosis. So you want a mechanism that's focused and testable. And then, are the aims feasible and do they test the hypothesis? So the group is really nice for being able to take the aims page and just look at it bit by bit. So I'm going to give my personal email, and this is me. If you have questions, you're very welcome to email me. Just say, new investigator or something like that in the subject line, because I get like 400 to 600 emails a day, and it's kind of an ugly sort of situation. And that's it for this. Thank you very much.